The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Seattle General Hospital as I held my newborn son, Daniel, for the first time. His tiny fingers wrapped around mine, and I felt a love I'd never experienced before wash over me. My wife, Sarah, lay, exhausted but glowing in the hospital bed, her auburn hair spread across the pillow like a halo. The antiseptic smell of the hospital room couldn't mask the sweet scent of our newborn baby, and the steady beeping of monitors created a rhythmic backdrop to this life-changing moment. "He's perfect, Marcus," she whispered, her voice hoarse from hours of labor. "Absolutely perfect." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. After 3 years of struggling to conceive, Daniel felt like a miracle. We'd spent our savings on fertility treatments, endured countless doctor appointments, suffered through 2 heartbreaking miscarriages, and worked extra shifts at our respective jobs. Me as a high school math teacher at Roosevelt High School, Sarah as a pediatric nurse at Children's Hospital, all for this moment. The journey to parenthood hadn't been easy. Sarah had cried herself to sleep more nights than I could count, questioning if there was something wrong with her, something she had done. I'd held her through the darkest moments, when the monthly disappointments felt like personal failures, when friends announced their pregnancies with ease while we struggled in silence. The fertility clinic became our second home, with its sterile waiting rooms and hopeful pamphlets that promised miracles for the right price. Dr. Martinez, Sarah's obstetrician, smiled warmly as she finished her final checks. "You two have been through quite a journey to get here. This little guy is lucky to have parents who fought so hard for him." The October sky outside was gray and heavy with rain clouds, typical for Seattle this time of year. Through the window, I could see the Space Needle piercing the cloudy horizon, a reminder of the city we'd chosen to call home despite its challenges. The cost of living was high, the weather could be depressing, but it was where Sarah had gotten her nursing degree at the University of Washington, where I'd found my calling teaching teenagers who reminded me daily why education mattered. Our families had questioned our choice to stay in Seattle. Sarah's parents lived in the small Oregon town where she'd grown up, constantly suggesting we'd be happier and financially better off if we moved closer to them. My father, of course, had his own opinions about our life choices, none of them particularly flattering. "Look at those eyelashes," Sarah murmured, gently stroking Daniel's cheek. "He's gonna break hearts someday." I laughed softly, careful not to wake him. "Let's focus on getting him through his first day before we worry about his future romantic prospects." The peaceful bubble burst when my father walked through the door. Richard Sterling commanded attention wherever he went. At 62, his silver hair was perfectly styled despite the late hour. His Italian suit probably cost more than my monthly salary, and his presence filled the room with an energy that made everyone else feel smaller. He built his tech empire from nothing, turning a small software company called Sterling Solutions into a billion-dollar corporation that dominated the cloud computing industry. But success had hardened him, turning family relationships into business, transactions and emotional connections into strategic alliances. The man who walked through that hospital door wasn't the father who had taught me to ride a bike or helped me with homework. That version of Richard Sterling had died along with my mother 5 years ago, leaving behind this cold, calculating stranger who measured everything in profit margins and return on investment. "So this is my grandson," he said, his voice carrying that tone I remembered from childhood, detached, analytical, like he was evaluating a potential acquisition during a board meeting. "Dad, meet Daniel," I said cautiously. We hadn't spoken in 6 months, not since our last argument about my lack of ambition and my decision to turn down a lucrative position at Microsoft to stay in teaching. His sudden appearance at the hospital surprised me. I'd sent him a text when Sarah went into labor, more out of obligation than any real expectation that he'd show up. Asterisk, he approached slowly, his sharp blue eyes the same color as mine, though his held none of the warmth I remembered from childhood, studying the baby with unusual intensity. For a moment, I thought I saw something soften in his expression, a crack in the armor he'd built around his heart since Mom died. His hands, usually so confident and decisive, hesitated as they reached toward the blanket. "He looks like you did. As a baby," he said quietly, his voice catching slightly. "Same nose, same stubborn chin." Then, turning to Sarah with what passed for charm in his world, "Congratulations. He's beautiful." Sarah smiled warmly, always the peacemaker in our family dynamics. "Would you like to hold him? I think he'd like to meet his grandfather." My father hesitated, then shook his head abruptly, as if the moment of vulnerability had been a weakness he needed to correct. "I'm not good with babies." He straightened his tie, a vulnerable moment passing like a cloud across the sun. "Marcus, I need to speak with you, privately." My stomach dropped. Nothing good ever came from my father's private conversations. They usually involved lectures about my career choices, unsolicited advice about financial planning, or thinly veiled criticisms of my lifestyle. I glanced at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly despite her exhaustion, then followed him into the hallway. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows on his face as he turned to me, transforming his distinguished features into something more predatory. The hospital corridor was quiet except for the distant sounds of medical equipment and muffled conversations from other rooms. A nurse walked by, her sneakers squeaking on the polished floor, and nodded politely to my father. Even strangers could sense his importance. "I have a proposition," he said without preamble. "Dad, if this is about money, it's always about money, son. That's how the world works. Everything else is just sentimentality." He pulled out his phone, navigating to his banking app with practiced ease. $1 million. Transferred to your account today. I stared at the screen, my tired brain struggling to process what I was seeing. The number was real, sitting there in his account like it was pocket change. "What are you talking about?" "I want to adopt Daniel, legally. He'll be my son, not yours." His voice was matter-of-fact, like he was discussing a stock purchase or a merger. "You and Sarah are struggling financially. This would solve all your problems. The boy would have every advantage, the best schools, private tutors, opportunities. You could never provide on a teacher's salary." The words hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs. Around us, the hospital continued its steady rhythm of life and death, healing and hope, but I felt like I was drowning. "You want to dot by my son?" I prefer to think of it as securing his future. He pocketed the phone with the casual indifference of someone who had just offered to purchase a newspaper. "You're 28 years old, Marcus. You teach algebra to teenagers who don't want to learn. Live in a cramped apartment in Capitol Hill that's probably overpriced, and drive a Honda Civic that's older than some of your students. Is that really the life you want for him?" The casual cruelty in his words was nothing new. I'd grown up with his constant assessments of my perceived failures, but it felt different now. More personal, more devastating. This wasn't just about my life anymore. It was about my son's future. "He's 3 hours old, Dad. 3 hours. And you're already trying to take him away from us. I'm trying to give him everything you can't." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope, the kind lawyers use for important documents. "The papers are already drawn up. $1 million plus I'll establish a trust fund for his education. He'll want for nothing." The envelope seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds in the space between us. I stared at it like it was a snake, coiled and ready to strike. "You came to the hospital with legal papers? You planned this?" "I plan everything. It's why I'm successful and you're..." He gestured vaguely at my worn jeans and wrinkled shirt, the clothes I'd thrown on when Sarah's contractions started. At 3 in the morning. Well, you're not. The dismissal in his voice transported me back to childhood, to every school play he'd missed because of business meetings, every birthday dinner cut short by important phone calls, every moment when I'd realized that his love came with conditions and performance metrics. Get out. Don't be hasty. Think about what this means for. Get out. My voice echoed down the hallway, drawing concerned looks from passing medical staff. A security guard at the nurse's station looked up, assessing whether intervention might be needed. Get out before I do something we'll both regret. He straightened his suit jacket with the same mechanical precision he brought to everything else in his life, his face returning to its usual cold mask. The brief glimpse of the grandfather who might have been disappeared completely, replaced by the corporate predator I knew all too well. You have 48 hours to consider my offer. After that, it expires. It's expired now. We'll see. He turned to leave, his expensive shoes clicking against the hospital floor with military precision. Then he paused, delivering his final blow with surgical accuracy. Your mother would have wanted what's best for him, Marcus. Think about that. The mention of Mom hit me like a sucker punch to the gut. She'd been gone for 5 years, but her absence still felt like an open wound, especially in moments like this when I desperately needed her wisdom. She would have known what to say to him, how to reach whatever humanity he had left, buried under all that money and ambition. After he left, I stood in the hallway for a long time, shaking with rage and something else, fear. Because despite everything, despite his cold manipulation and casual cruelty, a small part of me wondered if he was right. Could I really give Daniel the life he deserved? Was love enough when the bills kept coming and the future felt so uncertain? The hospital continued its rhythm around me, doctors making rounds, families celebrating new arrivals, the eternal cycle of hope and healing. But I felt frozen, caught between the love I had for my son and the doubt my father had planted like a virus in my mind. When I returned to the room, Sarah took one look at my face and knew something was wrong. She'd always been able to read me like that, seeing through my attempts to hide worry or pain. It was one of the things that had drawn me to her in the first place, her ability to see people really see them, not just the surface they presented to the world. What did he want? She asked softly, shifting Daniel to one arm so she could reach for my hand. I sat heavily in the uncomfortable hospital chair beside her bed, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline from the confrontation was wearing off, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. He wants to adopt Daniel. He offered us $1 million. Sarah's face went pale, her green eyes widening with shock. He what? He thinks we can't provide for him. That Daniel would be better off as his son instead of ours. The words tasted bitter in my mouth. He came here with legal papers already drawn up. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sounds were the beeping of monitors and Daniel's soft breathing from the bassinet beside the bed. Outside, the Seattle rain continued its steady percussion against the windows, and I could hear the distant sound of traffic navigating the wet streets below. $1 million, Sarah whispered finally, her voice barely audible. That's a lot of money, Marcus. My heart sank. I'd expected immediate outrage, fierce protection of our child. But instead, I heard something that sounded dangerously like consideration. You're not thinking about it. No, God, no. I just ... She looked at her son, then back at me, tears beginning to form in her eyes. What if he's right? What if we can't give Daniel everything he needs? What if love isn't enough? It was a question that would haunt me for the next 3 days. As we brought Daniel home to our small apartment on Capitol Hill, and tried to navigate the first overwhelming weeks of parenthood. Every time Daniel cried, every time we struggled to pay a bill, every time we looked at his future and wondered what we could realistically provide, my father's words echoed in my mind like a persistent drumbeat. The manila envelope sat on our kitchen counter, unopened but impossible to ignore, like a presence in our home that changed the very air we breathed. $1 million. More money than we'd ever dreamed of having. And all it would cost us was our son. Chapter 2. Pressure and Revelations. 3 weeks after Daniel's birth, the pressure was mounting from all sides like a slowly tightening vice. The medical bills from Sarah's complicated delivery were piling up on our kitchen table, even with insurance coverage that we thought was comprehensive. Each envelope that arrived seemed to contain another surprise fee, another charge we hadn't anticipated. The anesthesiologist's bill, the neonatal specialist who'd examined Daniel, the extended hospital stay when Sarah developed complications. The numbers added up to nearly $15,000 in out-of-pocket expenses. Our landlord, Mrs. Chun, had cornered me in the hallway of our apartment building the previous week with news that made my stomach churn. "I'm sorry, Marcus, but the building's property taxes went up significantly this year. I'll need to raise everyone's rent by $300 starting next month." She'd looked genuinely apologetic, but $300 might as well have been $3,000 with our current financial situation. At Roosevelt High School, Principal Davidson had pulled me aside after my AP calculus class, his usually jovial demeanor replaced by uncomfortable formality. "Marcus, I need to talk to you about some budget concerns for next year. The district is facing some serious financial challenges, and we may need to make some difficult decisions about staffing." The conversation had been polite but ominous, filled with euphemisms about restructuring and optimizing resources. What it really meant was that my job might not exist come September, and we both knew it. Every morning, I woke up feeling like I was drowning in an ocean of responsibilities and inadequacies. The weight of providing for Daniel pressed down on my chest like a physical force, making it hard to breathe sometimes. I'd lie awake at 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling and running calculations in my head. Mortgage payments, utility bills, health, insurance premiums, the cost of diapers and formula, and all the endless expenses that came with a newborn. Sarah had developed postpartum depression, though she refused to admit it or seek help. The woman who had always been my rock, my source of strength and optimism, now spent hours staring at Daniel with a mixture of fierce love and deep worry, constantly second-guessing every decision we made. What if we're not feeding him enough? She'd ask at 2 a.m., holding Daniel while he cried despite being fed just an hour before. What if that cry means something's wrong? What if we're failing him already? Her sister Emma, a family therapist who lived in Portland, had driven up to Seattle twice in the past few weeks, bringing casseroles and concerned looks. "Sarah, honey, this level of anxiety isn't normal," she'd said gently during her last visit. "Have you considered talking to someone?" Postpartum depression is incredibly common, and there's no shame in getting help. But Sarah would just shake, her head clutching Daniel tighter. "I'm fine. I just want to make sure we're doing everything right for him." The manila envelope had multiplied like some kind of legal virus spreading through our lives. More documents arrived daily, each more official and intimidating than the last. My father's lawyers were persistent, flooding us with information about trust funds, educational opportunities, and quality of life assessments that painted our current situation in increasingly bleak terms. One particularly thick packet contained detailed financial projections showing the difference between Daniel's potential future with us versus with my father. The numbers were stark and depressing. Our projected lifetime earnings as a teacher and nurse versus the multi-million-dollar inheritance he'd receive as Richard Sterling's adopted son. The opportunities for travel, education, networking, career, advancement, all laid out in neat columns that made our love seem inadequate by comparison. It felt like psychological warfare, a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to wear down our resistance through sheer relentless pressure. Every day brought new reminders of our limitations, new evidence that we might not be enough for our son. On a gray October morning, with Seattle's characteristic drizzle painting everything in shades of melancholy, my father showed up at our apartment unannounced. I answered the door in my pajamas, Daniel crying in the background, the smell of burned coffee filling the air, and yesterday's dishes still piled in the sink. It was 8 a.m. on a Saturday, the one day of the week when we allowed ourselves to sleep. In and move slowly, and his presence felt like an invasion. "You look tired, son," he said, pushing past me into our cramped living room without waiting for an invitation. His eyes took in everything with the calculating precision of a real estate appraiser. The secondhand furniture we'd bought at garage sales and thrift stores, the stack of unpaid bills on the coffee table, Sarah's nursing supplies scattered. Across every available surface, the general chaos that came with new parenthood. We're new parents. Of course we're tired. I closed the door harder than necessary, the sound echoing through our thin walls. "What do you want, Dad? I want to help." He pulled out his phone with the smooth efficiency of someone accustomed to having information at his fingertips. "Did you see this? Your school district is cutting 23 teaching positions next year. Your name was mentioned as a possibility." My blood ran cold as I stared at the news article he'd pulled up on his screen. The headline read, "Budget Crisis Forces Massive Teacher Layoffs in Seattle School District," and there, buried in the third paragraph, was a quote from the district. Spokesperson mentioning that newer teachers in non-essential subjects would be the first to face cuts. I hadn't seen the article, hadn't even known it was public yet. The preliminary notice had arrived in my school mailbox just 3 days ago, marked confidential, and I'd been hoping it was just a precautionary measure. "How did you? I have connections everywhere, Marcus. I make it my business to know what affects my family." His voice was gentle, almost sympathetic, but there was something predatory underneath it. "I also know you received a preliminary notice last week, and I know you haven't told Sarah yet." He was right on both counts, and his knowledge of private information that should have been confidential made my skin crawl. The uncertainty had been eating at me like acid in my stomach, but I couldn't bring myself to add more stress to Sarah's already fragile state. She was barely holding on as it was. The possibility of losing our primary income might push her over the edge entirely. I might not lose my job, it's just a possibility. Might not isn't good enough when you have a child to think about. He sat down on our couch without invitation, his expensive suit looking absurdly out of place among our mismatched cushions and discount store throw pillows. "Do you know what I was doing when I was your age? Building your empire?" I know the story. The saga of Richard Sterling's rise from nobody to tech mogul was family legend, told and retold at every holiday gathering and family function until it had taken on mythic proportions. "I was terrified," he said quietly, surprising me with his honesty. "Your mother was pregnant with you. We were living in a studio apartment in Belltown that was smaller than this place, and I was working 18-hour days just to keep us afloat. The difference is I had a plan. I had ambition." "I have ambition? Teaching high school math?" He laughed, but not cruelly, more like someone who genuinely couldn't understand a worldview so different from his own. "Marcus, you graduated summa cum laude from MIT with a degree in computer science and mathematics. You could have done anything, worked for Google, Microsoft, started your own company. Instead, you chose a profession that barely pays a living wage and gets less respect every year." The criticism stung because it echoed doubts I'd had about My own choices, especially in moments like this when financial reality crashed against idealistic dreams. I chose teaching because it matters, because helping kids understand math and science and critical thinking might actually make the world better. Noble sentiments don't pay for Daniel's future. Sarah emerged from the bedroom at that moment, Daniel finally quiet in her arms. She looked exhausted, her usually vibrant auburn hair lank and unwashed, wearing the same milk-stained sweater she'd slept in. The woman who had always taken pride in her appearance, who used to wake up early to do her hair and makeup even for 12-hour nursing shifts, now looked like she was barely surviving each day. My father's expression softened genuinely when he saw her, and for a moment I glimpsed the man who had once been capable of charm and warmth. "Sarah, you look lovely," he lied smoothly, his voice carrying the practiced sincerity of someone who knew how to make people feel better about themselves. "Thank you, Richard." She sat down carefully on the edge of the couch, cradling Daniel. Protectively, "How are you adjusting to being a grandfather?" "It's an adjustment," he admitted, his eyes fixed on Daniel with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "How are you adjusting to motherhood?" "It's challenging," she said, understating the situation so dramatically that I wanted to laugh and cry at the same time. "But we're managing, are you?" He gestured subtly to the stack of bills on the coffee table, the general chaos of our living space, the evidence of our struggling lives spread out like accusatory exhibits. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're drowning." "Dad," I started, that he held up a hand. "Let me finish. I'm not here to judge. I'm here to offer solutions." He pulled out a different envelope, this one thinner. I revised my offer. My heart sank. "We already told you no. Hear me out. Instead of adoption, I'm proposing a different arrangement. I become Daniel's legal guardian, but you remain his parents. Think of it as ... shared custody." Sarah and I exchanged glances. "What does that mean exactly?" she asked. "You keep your parental rights, but I make the major decisions about his upbringing. Education, healthcare, where he lives. In exchange, all your debts are paid. You receive a monthly stipend, and Daniel gets every advantage money can buy." "Where he lives?" I repeated. "You mean he wouldn't live with us? He'd spend time with both families? Weekends, holidays, summer vacations? You'd still be his parents, but he'd have stability, opportunities, a future." The offer was more tempting than I wanted to admit, not because I wanted to give up my son, but because the alternative seemed so uncertain. What if I did lose my job? What if we couldn't afford Daniel's needs? What if my father was right about love not being enough? "I need to think about it," Sarah said quietly. Sarah, asterisk, no, Marcus, we need to think about it. Really think about it. She looked at Daniel sleeping in her arms. "What if something happens to us? What if we can't provide for him?" My father sensed the crack in our resolve. "I'm not the enemy here. I want what's best for my grandson. And what's best for him is opportunity, education, security. Things you want to give him but can't." That afternoon, after he left, Sarah and I had our first real fight since Daniel was born. She thought we should seriously consider the offer. I thought we should cut contact with my father entirely. "He's manipulating us," I argued. "Can't you see that? Every problem he's pointing out, he's probably helping to create." "What if he is? What if he's right anyway?" Sarah's voice broke. "Marcus, I love Daniel more than my own life, but love doesn't pay for college. Love doesn't guarantee he'll have opportunities. So we just give up? Hand him over to a man who tried to buy him? We wouldn't be giving up. We'd still be his parents. Would we? If he's making all the decisions, if Daniel's living in his mansion, if he's choosing the schools and the friends and the values, what are we? The fight ended with both of us in tears, no closer to a resolution. That night, as I watched Daniel sleep in his crib, a crib we'd bought secondhand and painted ourselves, I realized my father had succeeded in something I hadn't expected. He'd made me doubt myself, but doubt, it turned out, was exactly what I needed to find my answer. Because as I sat there in our small apartment, surrounded by the evidence of our modest life, I finally understood something my father never had. Success isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in love, sacrifice, and the courage to do what's right even when it's hard. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. Chapter 3. The counterattack. I spent the entire night researching, fueled by coffee and determination. By dawn, I had a plan that would either save my family or destroy what little relationship I had left with my father. The key was something I'd remembered from my mother's stories about the early days of Sterling Tech. She used to tell me about the partnership documents my father had signed when he started the company. Documents that included a clause about family succession that he'd probably forgotten about after all these years. I called my college roommate, Jake, who'd become a corporate lawyer in Boston. After explaining the situation, he agreed to do some discreet digging into Sterling Tech's founding documents. "Marcus, this is a long shot," he warned. "Even if such a clause exists, it might not be enforceable after 30 years. Just check, Jake, please." While I waited, I did something I should have done weeks ago. I talked to Sarah's sister, Emma, who worked as a family therapist. Emma had always been skeptical of my father's wealth and influence. "What you're describing sounds like coercive control," Emma said when I called her. "He's using financial pressure to manipulate you into giving up your child. That's not love or concern. That's power. But what if we really can't provide for Daniel? What if he would be better off with my father's resources? Marcus, children need stability, love, and consistency more than they need money. Your father is offering the opposite. He's creating chaos and uncertainty, then positioning himself as the solution." That afternoon, Jake called back with news that made my heart race. "You're not going to believe this," he said. "Your father's original partnership agreement does include a family succession clause. It states that if he has male heirs, they have the right to claim a seat on the board and a percentage of company ownership when they reach the age of majority." "What does that mean exactly?" "It means you, as his son, are entitled to a 15% stake in Sterling Tech, and if you have male children, they're entitled to additional considerations." Jake paused. "Marcus, do you realize what 15% of Sterling Tech is worth?" I did some quick math based on the company's last reported valuation. About $300 million, give or take. The question is whether your father knows about this clause, and if he does, whether he's worried about it. Suddenly, my father's desperate attempts to gain control over Daniel made perfect sense. If he could legally adopt or gain guardianship of Daniel, he could potentially circumvent the succession clause entirely. This wasn't about giving Daniel opportunities. It was about protecting his empire. I spent the rest of the day preparing for a confrontation I'd been avoiding my entire adult life. That evening, I called my father and asked him to meet me at his office downtown. Sterling Tech's headquarters occupied 3 floors of a gleaming skyscraper in downtown Seattle. All glass and steel and modern art that costs more than most people's houses. I'd only been there a handful of times, always feeling like an outsider in my father's world of boardrooms and power lunches. My father was waiting in his corner office, the city lights twinkling below us. He looked confident, relaxed, like a man who always got what he wanted. "Marcus, I'm glad you called. Have you reconsidered my offer?" "I have." I sat down across from his massive desk, fighting to keep my voice steady. "I want to make you a counteroffer." His eyebrows rose slightly. "Oh, this should be interesting. I pulled out the documents Jake had prepared, copies of the original partnership agreement, highlighted and annotated. I want my 15% stake in Sterling Tech, the stake I'm legally entitled to as your heir. The color drained from his face. For the first time in my life, I saw my father look genuinely shocked. Where did you get those? Does it matter? The question is, did you really forget about this clause, or have you been trying to manipulate me and Sarah because you're afraid of it? He was quiet for a long moment, studying the documents. When he finally looked up, there was something different in his eyes, not anger, but what looked almost like respect. You've been busy, he said quietly. I learned from the best. You taught me that everything is about money, remember? So what do you want? The stock. You can have it. It's meaningless if you don't know how to use it. I don't want the stock, Dad. I want you to leave my family alone. That's it. You're willing to give up $300 million. I'm willing to give up $300 million to keep my son. I leaned forward in my chair. But here's the thing. If anything happens to me or Sarah, if we have any financial difficulties that could be traced back to your interference, if you continue to harass us about Daniel, I will claim that stock. And I will use it to destroy everything you've built. His laugh was sharp, bitter. You destroy Sterling Tech? You're a high school teacher, Marcus. I'm a high school teacher with an MIT degree in computer science and mathematics. I understand your business better than you think. I pulled out my phone and showed him a detailed analysis I'd spent hours preparing. Your company has been making some questionable decisions lately. Overextended investments, risky partnerships, a few regulatory issues that haven't hit the news yet. It would be a shame if a major stockholder started asking difficult questions at board meetings. For the first time in my adult life, I saw my father look at me not as a disappointment, but as a threat. You're bluffing. Am I? You taught me that. Successful people always have leverage, Dad. Well, now I have leverage. I stood up to leave. Stay away from my family. Don't call. Don't visit. Don't send lawyers or documents or flowers. If you want a relationship with your grandson, you'll have to earn it the same way everyone else does, through love, respect, and trust. And if I refuse, then you'll find out just how much trouble a 15% stockholder can cause when he's motivated. I headed for the door, then turned back. Oh, and Dad, the next time you want to threaten someone's livelihood, make sure you're not leaving a paper trail. Jake found some very interesting communications between you and the school district's budget committee. I left him sitting in his office, surrounded by the symbols of his success, finally understanding that there were some things money couldn't buy. But as I drove home through the Seattle rain, I knew this was far from over. I'd won this battle, but my father was not a man who accepted defeat easily. The real test would come in the days and weeks ahead, when we'd find out if threatening him was enough to protect my family, or if I just declared war on one of the most powerful men in the city. Asterisk Chapter 4. Redemption and New Beginnings. 6 months passed in an uneasy truce. My father kept his distance, but I could feel his presence lurking at the edges of our lives. My teaching position was mysteriously secured despite the budget cuts, and several of our outstanding medical bills were anonymously paid. I suspected his involvement but couldn't prove it, and pride warred with relief every time another financial pressure disappeared. Daniel was growing fast, developing his own personality. He had Sarah's gentle nature, but my stubborn streak, and watching him discover the world filled me with a joy I'd never imagined possible. Our small apartment, which had once felt cramped and inadequate, now felt like exactly where we belonged. Sarah emerged from her postpartum depression slowly, with help from Emma and a support group for new mothers. I think I was so afraid of not being enough for him, She told me one evening as we watched Daniel sleep. But I realize now that being enough isn't about having all the answers or unlimited resources. It's about showing up every day and loving him through all of it. The peace was shattered on a cold February morning when my father appeared at our door, but this time he looked different. Older somehow, more fragile. His usually perfect appearance was disheveled, his eyes rimmed with red. "Marcus, I need to talk to you," he said quietly. Please, against my better judgment, I let him in. Sarah was at work and Daniel was napping, so the apartment was unusually quiet. "You look terrible," I said, not entirely without sympathy. "I've been sick," he admitted, sitting heavily on our couch. "Cancer, stage 3. I found out 2 weeks ago." The words hit me like a physical blow. Whatever I'd expected him to say, it wasn't that. "Dad, how long do you have?" 6 months, maybe a year if the treatment works. He looked around our apartment with different eyes now. "I've spent the last 6 months thinking about what you said, about earning a relationship with Daniel. And I think I've been going about this all wrong." He pulled out his phone, but instead of banking apps or legal documents, he showed me photos. "These are pictures of you as a baby. Your mother took hundreds of them." I stared at the screen, seeing myself in Daniel's features. My father swiped through the images, me taking my first steps, playing with toys, sleeping in my mother's arms. "She used to say you were perfect just as you were," he continued. "Not perfect because of what you might become or what you might achieve, but perfect because you were ours." I never understood what she meant until I saw Daniel that day in the hospital. "Dad, let me finish, please." His voice was shaking. "Now, I've spent 30 years building an empire, and for what? To leave it to strangers? To have money but no family to share it with?" He looked up at me with tears in his eyes. "I don't want to buy Daniel, Marcus. I want to know him. I want him to know me. Not as the man who tried to take him away from his parents, but as his grandfather." The word hung in the air between us. It was the first time he'd ever referred to himself that way. "What are you asking for?" "A chance. Nothing legal, nothing binding. Just ... a chance to be part of his life, to be part of your life." He reached into his jacket and pulled out the manila envelope that had haunted us for months. These are all the legal documents I had drawn up. The adoption papers, the guardianship agreements, all of it. He walked to our fireplace and threw the envelope into the flames. We watched in silence as months of manipulation and pressure turned to ash. "I can't undo what I've done," he said, "but I can stop doing it. I can try to be the grandfather Daniel deserves, if you'll let me." Asterisk, I wanted to stay angry. Part of me wanted to throw him out, to protect my family from any more of his schemes. But looking at him now, really looking at him, I saw something I'd never seen before. I saw my father as a human being, flawed and frightened and running out of time. "What would that look like?" I asked carefully. "I don't know. I've never been a grandfather before." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Maybe you could teach me. Maybe we could figure it out together." Over the next few months, we did figure it out slowly and carefully. My father started coming by once a week just to visit. He didn't bring gifts or grand gestures, just his time and attention. He learned to change diapers, to warm bottles, to make silly faces that made Daniel giggle. The transformation was remarkable. Away from his office and his empire, my father became someone I'd never met, patient, gentle, genuinely interested in the small moments that make up a life. He told me stories about my mother I'd never heard, shared memories of my own childhood that I'd forgotten. "Your mother would have loved this," he said one afternoon, holding Daniel while Sarah and I prepared dinner. She always said the best parts of life were the quiet moments. I never believed her until now. His health declined steadily, but his spirits seemed to improve with each visit. He established a college fund for Daniel, not as a condition or manipulation, but as a gift from a grandfather who wanted to contribute to his grandson's future. He also quietly transferred a portion of Sterling Tech stock to me, not as leverage or obligation, but as inheritance. I want you to have choices, he explained. You can keep it, sell it, donate it to charity, whatever feels right to you. But I want Daniel to know that his grandfather believed in taking care of family. The end came faster than we expected. In early autumn, almost exactly a year after Daniel's birth, my father suffered a stroke. I sat by his hospital bed for 3 days, holding his hand, telling him about Daniel's latest achievements, rolling over, trying to crawl, babbling what might have been data. On the 3rd day, he squeezed my hand and whispered, "Thank you for letting me love him." He died that evening, peacefully, with Sarah and me beside him. The funeral was enormous. Hundreds of business associates, politicians, society figures who had known Richard Sterling, the entrepreneur. But afterward, we held a smaller service, just family and close friends, to remember the man who had learned to be a grandfather in his final months. As I stood in our apartment that night, Daniel asleep in my arms, I thought about the journey we'd taken. My father had tried to buy my son, had manipulated and pressured us, had nearly destroyed our family in his desperation to control our lives. But in the end, he learned what I'd tried to tell him from the beginning. Love can't be purchased or negotiated or legally enforced. It has to be earned day by day, moment by moment, through showing up and caring and choosing to put someone else's needs above your own. The irony wasn't lost on me that by threatening to use his money against him, I'd finally gotten him to understand that money wasn't the answer. Sometimes you have to speak someone's language before you can teach them a new one. Sarah found me standing there in the dark, lost in thought. "How are you feeling?" she asked softly. "Sad, but also grateful." I looked down at Daniel, who had inherited his grandfather's determination and his parents' capacity for love. I think he would have been proud of who Daniel becomes. I think he already was. A year later, we moved into a bigger apartment using part of the inheritance. Not because we needed to prove anything or because we thought Daniel required luxury, but because we could afford to give him a little more space to grow. I kept teaching because I loved it, but I also started a small foundation using Sterling Tech dividends to provide educational opportunities for students whose families couldn't afford them. Daniel's first word was Dada, followed closely by Mama. He never knew the grandfather who tried to buy him, but he carries photos of the man who learned to love him. When he's old enough, I'll tell him the whole story, the good parts and the difficult parts, the mistakes and the redemption, because that's what families do. We mess up, we hurt each other, we make terrible decisions based on fear and pride and desperation. But if we're lucky, if we're willing to change and grow and forgive, we also get the chance to do better. My father wanted to leave Daniel a legacy of wealth and power. Instead, he left him something more valuable, the knowledge that love is always worth fighting for, and that it's never too late to become the person your family needs you to be, even when that fight costs you everything else you thought mattered. Epilogue. 10 years later, the morning sun streamed through the windows of our new house in Queen Anne, a modest 3-bedroom that felt like a mansion compared to our old Capitol Hill apartment. Daniel, now 10 years old, sat at the kitchen table working on his math homework while Sarah packed his lunch for school. The scene was so ordinary, so perfectly normal, that sometimes I had to remind myself how close we'd come to losing it all. "Dad, can you help me with this problem?" Daniel asked, pushing his notebook across the table. I don't understand why the answer is negative. I looked at the algebra equation, something that would have been challenging for most fifth graders. That was routine for Daniel, who had inherited both his grandfather's analytical mind and his parents' curiosity about how things worked. What happens when you subtract a larger number from a smaller one? You get a negative, he said, then paused as understanding dawned. Oh, because we're going backwards on the number line? Exactly. I ruffled his dark hair, which was getting too long and made him look more like his grandfather every day. Sometimes the answer isn't what we expect, but it's still the right answer. Sarah caught my eye over Daniel's head, smiling at the unintended life lesson. She looked healthy now, vibrant in a way she hadn't during those first difficult months. After Daniel's birth, the postpartum depression had been a long battle, but with therapy and time, she'd found her way back to herself. Her work at Seattle Children's Hospital had become more than a job. She'd been promoted to head of pediatric nursing and was working on a master's degree in healthcare administration. I need to get to school early today, she said, kissing. Both of us get by. The new interns start their rotation, and I want to make sure they understand our protocols. After she left, Daniel and I finished breakfast in comfortable silence. This had become our morning routine. Sarah left early. I drove Daniel to school, then headed to Roosevelt High School, where I was now the department head for mathematics. The irony wasn't lost on me that my father's inheritance had allowed MD to stay in the profession he'd once criticized, but with the financial security to make choices based on passion rather than desperation. Dad, Daniel's voice was thoughtful as we walked to the car. Tell me again about Grandpa Richard. It was a conversation we'd had many times over the years, each iteration revealing more details as Daniel grew old enough to understand more complex emotions and motivations. I'd never hidden the truth from him, the attempted purchase, the manipulation, the final reconciliation, but I'd always tried to present it in age-appropriate ways. What do you want to know? Was he really as mean as he sounds in the beginning of the story? I considered the question as we drove through Seattle's morning traffic, past the familiar landmarks that had witnessed our family's journey. He wasn't mean, exactly. He was scared. And sometimes when people are scared, they do things that seem mean because they don't know how else to protect what they care about. But why was he scared of us keeping me? Because he thought that if you stayed with us, you might not have all the opportunities he could give you. He measured love by what he could buy or control, and it took him a long time to learn that wasn't how love works. Daniel nodded solemnly, processing this information the way he processed everything, carefully and thoroughly. Do you think he would have liked me if he'd lived longer? I think he loved you from the moment he saw you, I said, pulling into the school parking lot. He just had to learn how to show it. At Roosevelt High School, my first class was a P calculus, a room full of 17 and 18-year-olds, who reminded me daily why I'd chosen teaching over corporate success. Today, like every day, there were students who were struggling with concepts that seemed impossible, others who grasped them intuitively, and a few who challenged me to think about mathematics in ways I'd never considered. Mr. Sterling, asked Jennifer Park, one of my brightest students, why did you become a teacher instead of working for a tech company? My dad says you could have made way more money. It was a question I got at least once a semester, usually, from students whose parents worked in Seattle's booming tech industry. What makes you think success is only measured by money? Well, isn't it? Asked Marcus Johnson. The fact that he shared my name was a coincidence that never failed to amuse me. I mean, the whole point of education is to get a good job that pays well, right? Is it? I wrote a simple equation on the whiteboard. Success equals. What variables would you put in this equation? The discussion that followed was why I loved teaching. These kids, some from wealthy families in Bellevue, Others from working class neighborhoods, like the one I'd grown up in, had to grapple with fundamental questions about what made life meaningful. By the end of the class, we'd filled the whiteboard with variables: money, yes, but also happiness, relationships, impact on others, personal fulfillment, creativity, security, freedom. So, which variables matter most? I asked as the bell rang. That depends on who's solving the equation, Jennifer said, gathering her books. Different people might weight the variables differently. Exactly. And that's why there's no single right answer to how you should live your life. During my lunch break, I did something I'd started doing every year on this date. I visited my father's grave. Wakeview Cemetery sat on a hill overlooking Lake Washington, its manicured grounds a stark contrast to the urban landscape below. My father's headstone was impressive but not ostentatious. Richard Sterling, 1962 to 2025, beloved father and grandfather. I'd added the word grandfather myself, over the objections of the funeral director, who pointed out that my father had only held that title for a few months. But those months had mattered, and I wanted them remembered. "Hey, Dad," I said, settling onto the bench I had installed nearby. "Daniel's doing well. Made the honor roll again, and he's starting to show real aptitude for computer programming. Reminds me of someone I used to know." The conversation was one-sided, but it felt necessary. Over the years, I'd shared Daniel's milestones here. His first steps, his first day of school, his first soccer goal, his first science fair victory. I told my father about Sarah's promotions, about the foundation I'd started in his name, about the scholarship recipients who sent thank you letters every semester. "We're doing okay," I continued. "Better than okay, actually. The Sterling Educational Foundation has helped over 300 kids go to college now. Turns out your money is doing exactly what you always wanted it to do, creating opportunities for the next generation." A gentle breeze rustled the trees overhead, and I could smell the faint scent of cherry blossoms from the nearby grove. Spring in Seattle was always a revelation after the long, gray winter, a reminder that beauty could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances. "I've been thinking about legacy lately," I said. "About what we leave behind and how we're remembered. You were so worried about building something that would last, about making sure the Sterling name meant something important. But you know what? Daniel doesn't even carry your name, and he's still your legacy. Every time he shows kindness to someone who's struggling, every time he chooses to do the right thing, even when it's hard, every time he demonstrates that love is more powerful than fear, that's you living on." The visit to the cemetery had become a form of meditation, a way to process the complex emotions that came with grief and forgiveness. My father had died before we could fully repair our relationship, but the time we'd had at the end had been enough. Enough to show Daniel what a grandfather's love looked like. Enough to demonstrate that people could change. Enough to prove that redemption was always possible, even in the final act. That evening, the three of us sat in our living room, Sarah grading papers for her graduate program, Daniel building an elaborate Lego city, and me reading submissions for the foundation's latest scholarship competition. It was quiet, domestic, unremarkable in every way, except for how remarkable it felt to me. "Can I ask you guys something?" Daniel said suddenly, looking up from his construction project. "Of course," Sarah said, setting aside her textbook. "Do you ever regret not taking Grandpa Richard's money? I mean, the $1 million he offered when I was born?" Sarah and I exchanged glances. It was a more sophisticated version of questions Daniel had been asking for years, and it deserved a thoughtful answer. "That's a complicated question," I said. "Do you mean, do we regret not having the money, or do we regret not making the deal?" "Both, I guess." "Well, we did get the money eventually," Sarah pointed out. "When your grandfather died, he left us enough to be comfortable. But more importantly, we got something we couldn't have bought." What's that? Asterisk, we gotta be your parents, I said. Every day from the very beginning. We got to be the ones who held you when you cried, who celebrated when you took your first steps, who helped you learn to read. If we'd made that deal, someone else would have those memories. Daniel considered this seriously, but I might have gone to better schools or had more opportunities, or you might have, Sarah agreed. But you also might not have learned some of the things that matter most, like how to be resilient when things are difficult, or how to value relationships over possessions, or how to fight for what you believe in. Besides, I added, you're getting plenty of opportunities now. You're in advanced classes, you have music lessons, you play soccer, you're learning to code. The difference is that these opportunities come with love attached, not conditions. Daniel nodded slowly. I think I understand. It's like that math problem from this morning. Sometimes the answer isn't what you expect, but it's still the right answer. Exactly. Later that night, after Daniel had gone to bed, Sarah and I sat on our back deck overlooking the city lights. The Space Needle glowed in the distance, and we could hear the faint sound of traffic from the street below. These quiet moments together had become precious to us, especially after nearly losing our family in those early chaotic months. Do you think we made the right choice? Sarah asked, echoing Daniel's earlier question. Which choice? Keeping Daniel, or telling your father to back off? All of it. The whole journey. She leaned against my shoulder, her hair smelling like the vanilla shampoo she'd used since college. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we'd been less stubborn, more willing to compromise. We would have compromised our son away, I said firmly. And I don't think we'd ever have forgiven ourselves. But look at how much stress we went through. The depression, the financial struggles, the uncertainty about your job. What if we'd been wrong? What if love really wasn't enough? It was a question that still haunted both of us occasionally, usually late at night when the doubts crept in. But the answer had become clearer over the years. Love was enough, I said. But it wasn't the only thing. We had to fight for it, work for it, make sacrifices for it. We had to get help when we needed it, make difficult decisions, stand up to people who had more power than us. Love isn't magic, it's action. Sarah was quiet for a moment, watching the city lights twinkle below us. Your father understood that at the end, didn't he? That love is something you do, not something you buy. I think so. I hope so. Daniel's lucky to have his story, she said. Not many kids get to grow up knowing that their parents literally fought the world to keep them. He's lucky to have us, and we're lucky to have him. That's the real legacy, not the money or the business empire or the foundation, but the fact that we chose each other every day, even when it was hard. We prepared for bed. I found myself thinking about the scholarship applications I'd read earlier. 23 students from across the Pacific Northwest, each with their own story of struggle and determination, each hoping for the opportunity to pursue their dreams despite financial obstacles. The Sterling Educational Foundation would be able to help 8 of them this year, thanks to my father's money and the careful stewardship Sarah and I had practiced over the past decade. One application in particular had stayed with me. A 17-year-old girl from a small town in eastern Washington who wanted to study engineering, but whose family couldn't afford college. Her essay about overcoming poverty and discrimination to maintain a 4.0 GPA while working part-time too, help support her siblings reminded me of my father's early struggles, of the ambition and determination that had driven him to build his empire. The difference was that this girl wouldn't have to choose between success and relationships, between ambition and love. The scholarship would give her opportunities without requiring her to sacrifice her values or her connections to the people who mattered most. That night, as I checked on Daniel before going to bed, I found him still awake, reading a book about Computer programming by the light of his desk lamp. Lights out, buddy, I said softly. You need your sleep. Just 5 more minutes. This chapter is really interesting. It's about how early computers were programmed by women during World War II, but most people don't know about it because they didn't get credit for their work. I smiled, recognizing my father's intellectual curiosity and Daniel's eager questions. 5 more minutes. Then lights out, okay, Dad? He said as I turned to leave. I'm glad you and Mom kept me. Me too, son, me too. Asterisk as I walked back to our bedroom. I passed the framed photo on the hallway wall, the last picture taken of my father holding Daniel, just 2 weeks before he died. In the image, my father's face shows a piece I'd rarely seen during his lifetime, and Daniel is reaching up to touch his grandfather's cheek with the unselfconscious affection that only small children possess. It wasn't the legacy my father had planned, but it was the one that mattered. Not a business empire or a family name carved in stone, but a moment of pure love between generations, a love that had been tested, fought for, and ultimately proved stronger than money, fear, or pride. In the end, that was the only currency that truly counted.